Should Jets fans be concerned with the slow starts in preseason games? What role could Lawrence Cager have? And what should fans think about Jeff Ulbrich? We'll discuss all this and more on today's Mailbag episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, August 24th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button, and you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today we have our weekly mailbag. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Each Wednesday we try and do a mailbag, although some weeks we have to move it to a different day as the schedule demands. This week, though, we have it on Wednesday. So let's begin. Our first question comes from Cameron. John, last season it seemed like a running theme that the Jets would be asleep at the wheel for the first half and not wake up until the third quarter when they would finally begin to look like an actual football team. So far in preseason, the same has been true in both games. It's nice seeing adjustments being made coming out of the half, but it's also worrying that the team can't seem to kick things into gear from the beginning of the game. What are you seeing, if anything, that is contributing to this, or am I just a pessimistic Jets fan after 28 years of sadness? Well, I hear that. I think we're all, on some level, a little frustrated and pessimistic after what we've seen through all these years. I think if we're talking about slow starts, I think we have to differentiate between what happened last year and what's happening in preseason. Now, that Atlanta game in particular, to me, that was 100% because the Falcons were playing starters and the Jets weren't. The Jets, I think the only Jets starters who played were rookies. I mean, even Elijah Moore did not see the field. The Jets guys were going to be starting. There was Sauce Gardner, there was Bryce Hall, there was Garrett Wilson. But outside of that, the Jets were really playing backups, and they were playing the third-string quarterback versus Atlanta was playing their starters through a good chunk of that first half. So in preseason, you can never really get too crazy about it because a lot of these matchups are not apples to apples. And even in the Philadelphia game, when the Jets came out and looked awful at the very beginning, starters did not play. Now, the starters got beaten pretty badly, but they didn't play that long. They didn't play long enough to really make any sort of definitive statements. And the other thing you have to remember is that in preseason, you're not game planning. In the regular season, when the other team has the ball and it's like 3rd and 6, you have a play specifically designed that you think will work. Your personnel versus their personnel, this is the best play. We're calling this. In the preseason, I think you're more in evaluation mode. I always say this, the preseason, the score doesn't matter. It's really about the individual evaluations. And the other way I look at this is, let's say the opposite was true. Let's say the Jets were dominating early in preseason games. Would that make you totally confident that what we saw last year was an aberration? The answer is probably no. Now, why did the Jets get off to such slow starts to games last year? I mean, there are lots of reasons, but I think the biggest one was just the talent level on the roster was very low. My own theory on this as well is that I think there may be something to the idea that because they were such a young team, maybe they could not, there was something about the way they were preparing, maybe something went wrong early and it kind of led the team to unravel, which I think might be one of the reasons they brought in more veteran leadership. That's just my theory, but I think there might be something to that idea. I don't think there are any easy answers, though, but I don't think that anything that's happening in the preseason should necessarily alarm you inordinately. I don't think that it's really any sort of a sign of what's to come. I'm worried because of what I saw last year. Whenever somebody asks me a question, am I worried about something that's happened in the preseason because it happened last year? I say, no, I'm worried because it happened in the regular season games last year. But the fact it happened in the preseason this year is meaningless because at the end of the day, how much does preseason carry over to the regular season? Not a lot. There's just too many different moving parts in preseason games. So I would not get too worried with that. I mean, you're coaching to evaluate players. You're trying to settle position battles. And no, I don't think the Jets have a ton of starting position battles, but they may have position battles for like the number 2 spot in certain positions. And obviously you have roster battles. You have guys who are fighting for their lives on roster. So you may focus more on them. Even your play calling, you may focus on featuring these guys to give them a chance to show what they can do. I think there's just a lot of different moving parts, and I don't think you can take a team-wide result in preseason and say that it matters. I mean, you can look back. The Detroit Lions went 0-16 back in, I think it was 2008. They went undefeated in the preseason. That shows you how much preseason results really matter. Now, I know we love preseason because the Jets have not lost a preseason game since 2019. They were 2-0-1 last year. They're 2-0 this year. There was no preseason in 2020 because of COVID. So maybe we should love the preseason, but I don't think it's as significant as a lot of people make it out to be. I think you're playing with backup players. You're frequently looking at mismatches. I mean, this could happen this week. It sounds like the Jets are going to play their starters against the Giants in the preseason finale. And I don't know whether the Giants will, but if the Giants don't, the Jets will look great, and we'll be doing this in reverse. We'll talk about how great the Jets look heading into the regular season. But, ultimately, I'm not sure there's a lot of carryover. Our next question, do you see any starting caliber free safeties becoming available for a low cost on the trade market come roster cut time? I think the Jets could use some help at that position. Well, certainly the Jets could use some help at the free safety position. LaMarcus Joyner did not have a strong game against Atlanta. He was supposed to be a stable veteran back there, but he was making mistakes. It's a question mark. It's always possible. Sometimes a player just doesn't mesh with the coaching staff somewhere, and there's a surprise trade. I mean, last year the Jets needed an edge rusher, and Shaq Lawson became available. Although Houston was there were kind of rumblings that Houston was having issues with him, that he just wasn't a good fit for Houston's system. So there were some rumblings he was available on the trade block, and the Jets got him. I was not expecting that to happen. Now, Shaq Lawson ended up not being that great. He was good against the run, not really much of a pass rusher. Did make a pretty athletic interception in the Jets' victory over the Bengals. It was a key play in that victory. But all this is to say that sometimes you get a surprise. But I think at this point of the year, if you're looking to make a trade or you're looking to sign a quality starting player, you're kind of lucky if it works out, because most of the time the roster is set and teams aren't just going to be willing to give away starting level players. So I think it's tough. I think when you're talking about the waiver wire, now here's how things work in the NFL. We're approaching cut down day. Yesterday the Jets cut from 85 to 80. Last week they cut from 90 to 85. The big cut down is coming next week. After the final preseason game, the Jets will have to cut from 80 to 53. The way it works at cut down time is if you have 4 or more years of NFL experience, you automatically become a free agent. Your contract is gone. It's all over. Nothing to see here. If you have less than 4 years of experience, then you have to pass through what's known as the waiver wire. And that essentially gives the other 31 teams a chance to claim you. And if one of the other 31 teams claims you, they essentially say, we want you on our team. You get a spot on their 53-man roster, and they get your contract. They get your contract, the same contract as you had with the old team. Now, what happens if more than one team claims a player? It goes back to the draft order last year, and the team that was higher in the draft order, the team with the higher first-round draft pick, gets you. And essentially, it's a way to try and keep competitive balance, give the bad teams a chance to improve, and also give the players a chance to find a starting spot. Because if the worst team you go to, the better your chances are of playing. A smart team works the waiver wire effectively. I mean, the Jets have found some decent players since Joe Douglas took over on the waiver wire. They got Braxton Berrios off waivers. They got John Franklin Myers off waivers. Last year, they got Quincy Williams off waivers. So a team that knows what it's doing on the waiver wire can do very well. But I think if you're looking for expectations on the waiver wire, it's probably more along the lines of a Berrios than it is a Franklin Myers. It's more of a guy who could be a quality role player for you than a guy who's going to be an impact starter. Again, we're talking about expectations. There's always the John Franklin Myerses of the world who outperform expectations, and you feel very lucky if you get one of them, but that's not the expectation. The expectation, frankly, is that you don't get anybody useful. If you do what Joe Douglas has done and get one good player off the waiver wire per year, you've done very well, and it's those little things that add up. But I don't know what the Jets are going to be able to do at the safety position. I think they should absolutely be looking at free safeties who get cut. If they can work out a trade for somebody who's going to be cheap, who's a quality starter at the safety position, absolutely do it. I just don't know who that's going to be, and I kind of doubt it's going to happen. if there is that guy out there, by all means, go all in, go get that guy. But you look at the way the Jets approached this offseason, even with all the cap space, even with all the draft picks, there were so many holes on this roster that they were not going to be able to fill all of them. And it's just the way it works in the NFL. You need somebody to step up and surprise you out of nowhere. There are certain positions where you just need a player who you're not expecting to perform. Maybe it's a late round pick. Maybe it's a lower level guy you've been developing. They need somebody, whether it's a Jason Pinnock, whether it's a Will Parks, who did play well in that game against Atlanta. They just need somebody, I think, to emerge. And that's really what they need, a low-cost player who they're not expecting much from, or you or I are not expecting much from, to just step up and claim the spot out of nowhere. I think every team needs that at some position. It's not always safety, but at some position you just need somebody to step up, because you can't count on a great fit falling into your lap. It's just how it works, I think. I'd love to see it, though, and if it's possible, they should be all in. I just don't know that the right player is out there. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about a player who's been flashing in the preseason. What could Lawrence Cager's role be? Will he even make the team? I'll tell you what I think as we continue on this Wednesday mailbag. As I just mentioned, yesterday was a cut-down day. We have another one coming next week. It's an unfortunate day on the NFL calendar. Lots of players are going to need to look for new jobs. And whether you're looking for a new job or you're hiring, as you gear up for fall, you need the right people on your team to help your small business fire on all cylinders. And LinkedIn Jobs is here to make it easier to find the people you want to talk to faster and for free. You can create a job post in minutes on LinkedIn Jobs to reach your network and beyond to the world's largest professional network of over 810 million people, and then add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring so your network can help you find the right people to hire. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. And once again, I'm checking every day. I'm hoping that I'm not seeing Locked On hiring a new Locked On Jets host. Fortunately, no sign of that so far, so I'll still be with you. It doesn't look like they're looking to replace me just yet. But LinkedIn Jobs helps you find candidates you want to talk to faster. Did you know every week nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? So post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Again, that's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. Make sure you check out the Ultimate Pro Football Preview starting August 31st, an 8-episode extravaganza to get you ready for the NFL season. The local team experts of Locked On Podcast Network and Odyssey NFL Insiders all combine into one Ultimate NFL Preview. Starting August 31st, check for the Ultimate Pro Football Preview 2022 on your Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And today here on Locked On Jets, we are doing our weekly Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question: Lawrence Cager seems to have gone from a big deep threat limited receiver to a very athletic receiving tight end. Do you think it's realistic he can make an impact during the regular season? You know, when we talk about Cager, it shows you how important your situation is, because it's absolutely right to say that he was not anybody who looked like a good prospect as a wide receiver. I thought he looked really. There were certain skills he had. At training camp when I went last year, he did kind of flash a little bit, but he just did not seem like he had enough speed to succeed at the position. I said, how is he going to get separation? You move him to tight end, where he's still pretty big. Now you get him against linebackers and safeties. Suddenly he's fast enough. I'll give you another example. Michael Clemens. I've done a complete 180 on him in just a couple months. If you look at the show I did right after the draft, that was the one pick where I was like, I don't get why they did this. I don't like this pick. And then before the beginning of camp, I heard, well, they envision him like as a John Franklin Myers type player. And suddenly it all clicked for me. Like, oh, okay, I get it. That makes sense, him in that role. Because I thought when they drafted him, they thought he was just going to be like a pure edge guy, one of those guys they wanted to be kind of twitchy off the edge at the wide nine. And then suddenly when they said he's more of kind of a hybrid power end guy who maybe slides inside on passing, I was like, oh, okay, this skill set works. And the same thing with Cager. If Cager's still playing the wide receiver position, we're looking at him. He's probably going to be cut. He probably has no shot to make the team. Now he's a tight end. He's making plays in preseason. He's giving you hope as a potential athletic tight end prospect. I don't know if he's going to make an impact in the regular season. The tight end room is pretty full. Listen, the Jets gave C.J. Uzomah and Tyler Conklin pretty big money this offseason for a reason. They moved Cager because I think they saw something in him, but I don't think they're expecting anything. The way I view it, based on what Salah has said, is that I think that they kind of view tight end as two different positions. You've got Uzama's going to be kind of like your inline guy. And I think the backup for him is going to be Jeremy Ruckert. Conklin's going to be more of a move guy. You'll try and create matchups with him, maybe play some H-back. And I think Cager might be his backup. And I'm impressed by what we've seen from Cager right now. I'm happy to have him as depth at the tight end position. I think the Jets actually have pretty good tight end depth this year, which is the first time you can say that in forever. I think he's a backup this year. If he's called upon, he'll get his chance. But I think something would need to happen. I don't think he's a big part of the plans. I think there needs to be an injury. Otherwise, he's not going to see a lot of playing time. But if he does, maybe he can. Who knows? Maybe he can step up. Our next question, also about Lawrence Cager. The more I watch Cager, I see the potential of a legitimate receiving tight end. The more I watch Denzel Mims, the more I see an okay 5th or 6th receiver. At their respective places in the receiver tight end depth chart, and with only 53 spots, I see only one of them making the team. Cager has been learning and playing special teams since last year. Mims is playing special teams this year. Put on your GM hat. Who would you choose on the 53 and why? I don't know that I necessarily see it as Cager versus Mims. I think the Jets are keeping 4 tight ends. Listen, they kept 4 tight ends last year when they had the 4 tight ends they had last year, and they still kept them. I mean, that was Croft, Griffin, Wesco, and Dan Brown. Who I know Dan Brown was a pretty big special teamer for Brant Boyer, but come on, man, if you got those tight ends you're keeping 4, I think this year when you have legitimate tight ends, you're probably keeping 4. So I think Cager's likely to make the team, but. Since the question, would I choose Cager or would I choose Mims? I choose Cager because hasn't he shown more? I think he's shown way more. Mims has just been a big disappointment. I mean, honestly, I think the case for Mims at this point is essentially 2 years ago scouting reports that liked him. But we now have 2 years worth of information that suggests Mims is not a great player. Now, if it comes down to Mims versus Jeff Smith, would I keep Mims? Yeah, I would. I don't, it seems like the coaching staff really likes Jeff Smith. I don't really know why. I don't think Jeff Smith is very good. So like if it was Mims versus Smith, I'd keep him. I did an article a few weeks ago where I looked at players over the last decade, 1st or 2nd round picks who had similar production to Mims, and there really were not many guys who developed into quality starting players. There were a couple, though, who developed into quality backups. So I think that there's still a chance Mims could be a useful backup who's, if you call upon him for a couple of games, maybe he could step up. And he's made a few plays in preseason. He did have one drop against Philadelphia, and there was one penalty, which may or may not have been his fault. But I think that's the ceiling for Mims. Like, I'd be surprised if Mims went somewhere else and was a successsul starter. I could see him being maybe a good depth player, but part of that is you do need to play special teams, and it's kind of late for Mims to be. Listen, maybe he picks it up really well. I do think Mims' path to the roster is through special teams. I think he's got to show something on the special teams area because as number 5 receiver, it's tough to keep him, especially given how little he's shown you. It's not like he's shown 1,000-yard potential when he's been on the field for the Jets. So the question goes back to would I keep Mims or Cager? I'd keep Cager because Cager's looked more promising. Cager's produced more. Cager's earned it. I mean, honestly, I think the only rationale for keeping Mims over Cager, if that's what it came down to, would be that Mims was a 2nd-round pick and Cager was a non-drafted free agent. And I don't think that's a very good reason, 2 years in. Maybe it would have been a good reason 2 years ago because you're still going off your initial evaluation. But those evaluations are now pretty old. You now have a pretty decent body of work that tells you Cager has acclimated to a new position pretty well and Mims has not. I still don't know it comes down to that, though. I think it's possible it's Mims versus Jeff Smith, and that's a different discussion. I keep Mims then because I don't think Jeff Smith brings much to the table. Our next question, now this is a blast from the past. Who gets the John B. nod for worst preseason performance, Bryce Hall or Brandon Shell? I had completely forgotten about this. Brandon Shell, his rookie year, who's a guy the Jets drafted in the 5th round, 26, actually traded a future 4th round pick to get him in the 5th round in 2016. His rookie year, he played this game against the Eagles. It was the last preseason game of the year. It was one of the worst performances I've ever seen an offensive lineman. He was horrible in that game. I completely forgot about that until this question. In fact, this was the very beginning. I think it was the first month of the podcast. I remember saying, I think it was true that if this guy was not a draft pick, if this guy was not a player the Jets just traded a 4th round pick to draft, he probably would have been cut based on that performance. It was so bad. It was so unpromising. And the amazing thing, and this is a good reminder that preseason results only mean so much. he actually developed into a semi-decent right tackle for the Jets for a few years. He was never great, but actually was okay. He was never. I don't think he was a weakness for the Jets. So it shows you I think as bad as Bryce Hall was the other night. Brandon Shell was doing it against guys who were not even the practice squad players. Bryce Hall at least was losing to guys like Kyle Pitts. He was losing at least losing to first and second stringer. So that Brandon Shell performance was worse, but Brandon Shell may not have been the worst Jet in that game because that was Christian Hackenberg's big debut. He'd played a couple series the week before against the Giants and actually looked okay he actually kind of played pretty well against the Giants, but then that Eagles game saw a bunch of playing time and was a catastrophe, and that was kind of that was the first signal that this was not going to be a good pick for the Jets. So maybe Christian Hackenberg gets the award for worst preseason. I'd take Shell over Hall, though. As we close out today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about the defense, in particular the defensive coordinator, Jeff Ulbrich, a guy who a lot of Jets fans have concerns about. How worried should they be? I'll tell you what I think as we close out this Wednesday episode. Of course, the upcoming end of preseason means that the regular season is almost here. Jets play Baltimore just a few Sundays from now, and you should know that if you want to lay money down on that game or any other game, BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. You can find all of your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. You can find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, even combat sports, esports, golf, and yes, the NFL. The season is almost about to begin, and BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question: did you see the lack of communication for the second team defense as a poor reflection of Jeff Ulbrich or the system? Obviously, the lack of talent compared to Atlanta's first team played a part in them looking bad, but poor communication isn't necessarily a talent issue. Well, I think when Atlanta's first team was in there, Bryce Hall was the problem. He was just awful. He was misreading zones. He was getting burned by Kyle Pitts. He was getting burned by everybody. So I think a lot of the issues were Bryce Hall. I hate to put everything on one player, but Bryce Hall was terrible in that game. I like Bryce Hall, but he was awful in that game. Once we got to the second quarter, I think Atlanta, they put in Desmond Ridder. They had some backups in there, and that's really where I think the communication fell apart. I blame the players, first of all. Look, these are professional football players, and the Jets schemes were not that complicated. These were schemes they probably ran in high school. It's not that hard. Now, I do think on some level, if the communication's this poor, coaching has to come into play because there's probably something not being communicated. If players are playing that slow, if they're that unsure of things, in a scheme that shouldn't be that complicated, I guess coaching has to take a little bit of the grief there. But I think the biggest problem with the defense has been the talent. And I think that's the reason the Jets got burned. Bryce Hall and the talent were the biggest problems. And for the lack of communication, it's just the players. Listen, these are not overly complex schemes. So, again, I guess you want to blame Ulbrich a little bit. Maybe they're not teaching things correctly. Maybe guys aren't sure where they need to be. That's fine, but they really should be. These are, like I said, these are very vanilla schemes the Jets have been running. Next question: given the defense's struggle last year, how confident are you in Jeff Ulbrich's ability as a defensive coordinator? What would it take for the Jets to replace him either midseason or next offseason? Well, I don't know that I'm that confident in Ulbrich's ability. I don't know that I'm unconfident. Last year, he didn't really have players, and when you don't have players, it's difficult. People say that the scheme was too vanilla last year. Well, they were going with a lot of young players, and when you go in with a lot of young players, not only young players, but a lot of new parts, it's difficult to build a ton of complexity into the system because you have to have guys who are used to playing with each other. It's in some ways coverages, especially zone coverage, is like playing on the offensive line. You got to be able to communicate. You got to know where guys are going to be. How everybody's going to handle those situations, and the more experience you have playing with somebody, the better you get at it. And beyond that, there just was a talent gap on the defense. So we'll see. The theory is that you should play more complex. Well, there's another the counter to that, and this is something Matt Eberflus used with the Colts a few years back and got a lot of really good results out of an untalented defense, is that if your guys don't have talent, simplify things for them so that they know what to do in all situations. Just get them playing fast, get them playing on instinct, if they do, if you do the same thing over and over, they're just going to learn it by repetition. That's the counter to that. And so really, people will say, oh, they should be more complex. Well, on some level, you have to be complex in the NFL, but it's really more of a philosophical thing, whether you're simple or complex. Either can work, either can fail. For me, this year's the test for Jeff Ulbrich. You can always get fired if the Jets are as bad as they were last year with the upgraded talent level. I suppose Ulbrich could be fired in season. He definitely could be fired after the year, though. I mean, I think Ulbrich has to have at least a credible defense this year. Otherwise, I do think the Jets are going to have to look at making a change, because the defensive talent level is better this year. So I think if you're getting similar results, if you're still at the bottom of the league, then you have to look for a change. When we're talking about making a change in season, I don't really know what good that does, because you're still running the same scheme. You're still running the playbook. If it's just a different guy who's calling the plays, and is anybody on the Jets defensive coaching staff really that good? I guess Salah could take more responsibility, but I just don't know that an in-season change at a coordinator spot makes that big of a difference. There are certain situations where you could point to, but I think for the most part, it's just making a move to make a move. I don't think it'll happen in season. I think it could happen after the season if the Jets don't see pretty substantial improvement. And our last question, John, I'm sorry for the loss of your favorite player, Eddie Pinheiro. Hopefully Greg Zuerlein is able to replace him in your heart. I was wondering how much you attribute the struggles of Bryce Hall in the last preseason game to him playing on the opposite side of the field than he's used to. Last season, he wasn't lights out by any means, but it seemed like he proved that he was at least a starting caliber corner in this league. Would love to hear your thoughts. Well, first of all, thank you for those thoughts on Eddie Pinheiro. I'll tell you, Eddie Pinheiro will have a legacy with the Jets, the only player who could kick the ball competently between the years 2019 and 2022. So, Eddie, best of luck to you. My favorite player, now no longer a part of the team, Greg Zuerlein, which was probably always going to happen because Zuerlein's more experienced. And Joe Douglas and Brant Boyer love a big-legged kicker. But Zuerlein has a better track record in the league. But thank you to Eddie Pinheiro for those games you kicked last year, for kicking all those field goals and actually giving the Jets somebody who could kick the ball through the uprights. Now, for the question, Bryce Hall, how many of the issues were due to him playing on the opposite side? I mean, look, it's possible. There are always corners who prefer playing left or right. There's a difference, I guess. It's the same thing we talk about moving from one side to the other on the offensive line. It could make a difference. It shouldn't be that big of a deal, though. What do you make of it? What do I make of his struggles against the Falcons? I mean, it could just be that he had a bad game. Everybody's got awful games. Everybody's got games where they look useless. That could just be a really bad game for Bryce Hall. It might be that simple. It also could be that Bryce Hall was just a guy who wasn't as good as we made him out to be last year and got exposed. It didn't get exposed because he had Brandon Echols on the other side, so teams were more willing to go after Echols. I mean, that does happen at the corner position, where you have guys who look better on paper than they really are because there's a guy across from them who's a big weakness. So why go after him when I can go after the guy who's the big weakness? Bryce Hall, I think he's a good backup. I think he's a very good backup. Despite what we saw the other night, I think you could get by with him as a starter in this league. I don't think he's as good as people made him out to be. I don't think he's a number one corner. I don't think the outrage or when the Jets replaced him was justified. There's a difference between a guy not being a weakness and a guy being a strength. I think the Jets got two corners who could conceivably be strengths. I think Bryce Hall was a guy who was not a weakness. And for whatever reason, when people watch football, they view the only valid way to upgrade your team is to go from weaknesses to not weaknesses. They don't view going from not weakness to strength as a valid way to upgrade your team, when it could be just as good. Sometimes you upgrade your team more by going from not a weakness to a strength than the other way. But it's difficult to say based on one game. It may have just been, my theory right now is it was just one awful game. I hope that's what it is, because I do think Bryce Hall can be a valuable part of this team as a backup corner. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button. You'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please a 5-star review. It helps us out. So does giving this episode a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.